Right now, right as you're watching this video, very likely, the United Nations Climate Summit is taking place over in the United Emirates. This is the annual event where you have heads of state, billionaires, and the general global elite fly in on their private jets to discuss how much carbon you and me, the common citizens, will be allowed to use in the coming decade. And so with that as the general background, I thought that today it would be a great opportunity to expose some of the secret motivations and hidden backdoor machinations that are taking place behind the scenes. And to that end, I had the opportunity to sit down and speak with Mr. Seamus Bruner. He's an investigative journalist who recently published this book right here, Controligarchs, Exposing the Billionaire Class, Their Secret Deals, and the Globalist Plot to Dominate Your Life. And during the discussion, he shedded some much needed light on what these globalist plots are, how they manifest in practice, and what they actually mean for you and your family. Take a listen. Seamus, thank you so much for joining us. So to start with, maybe at a higher level, just at a 50,000 foot overview, can you break down for us what exactly is this globalist plot to dominate the lives of everyday people?
Certainly. So the controligarchs, as I call them, are the billionaires and bureaucrats plotting and scheming to dominate every aspect of your life. And the number one goal of the controligarchs is to transfer power away from people, away from countries, and more towards international institutions controlled by them. So this is people like Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, George Soros, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg. Those are the guys on the cover, but there's really, there's a lot more of them, unfortunately, who are working on this agenda to transfer power from nations to international institutions where they're unelected, they're unaccountable, controlled by the controligarchs.
Let me ask you this, and this is something I've been really fascinated by, which is that we did this long investigation last year into how agenda at the UN level, Agenda 21 manifests in different countries around the world in specific ways, and specifically as it relates to farmers, how the farmers are really feeling the brunt of it. And one thing I couldn't figure out was whether this was kind of this like organic, sort of ideologically aligned system where you have people on the bottom who are the grassroots, who are the like local organizations and the county levels and the city levels who are implementing the stuff because they really are ideologically aligned with the UN, and or whether there's like a real, whatever you want to call it, like a tight room of people smoking cigars, making these decisions, like I guess you would use the word cabal, but I noticed you make sure not to use the word cabal because it's too conspiratorial. But like, were you able to uncover anything like that where it's like an actual group sitting down together, plotting things, or is it just a confluence of interests?
Well, it's a great question, and that was really the question I wanted to uncover and answer in this book. And it's a mixture of both. I mean, there's absolutely at the grassroots level, there are true believers who sort of get persuaded, but before those people get persuaded and they become activists and they make organizations, before that happens, there is the cabal, and that's not my word, that's David Rockefeller's word. So in chapter 1 and in all the chapters, I put an epigraph quote at the top from the character in the chapter. And David Rockefeller, who is really the one of the godfathers of globalism, he has this quote, and I'll paraphrase it, but more or less it says, some believe that my family and I are part of a cabal working against the interests of the United States to form a world government. If that is the charge, I stand guilty of it, and I am proud of it. Now, that's more or less verbatim. He uses the word cabal. He says one world, and he says he's guilty and proud of it. So David Rockefeller, George Soros is in this group. The late Henry Kissinger is in this group. And Henry Kissinger, he was Klaus Schwab's mentor before the World Economic Forum was set up. Klaus Schwab came to the United States. He's a German, born in Germany. But he came to the United States, studied under Kissinger, and they all have gotten together at various times, many times, whether it's in UN meetings or World Economic Forum meetings, and whether they smoke cigars in the back room, I'm not sure. I'm sure there's plenty of cigar smoking going on. But they get together and they plot out. And so you mentioned Agenda 21. They've rebranded that to Agenda 2030. But going back, I mean, it was the New World Order before that. Henry Kissinger and George Soros, they've all talked about setting up this new world order. That term became toxic. Agenda 21 sort of became toxic. And alongside these agendas that they form in the dark room where you and I aren't allowed, we don't have a seat at those tables. They had the Millennium Development Goals. And I know in your excellent documentary, you came across the new rebranded term is the Sustainable Development Goals. And food and agriculture is just one of many on this list of 17 areas that's what I talk about when I say they want to dominate every aspect of your life. Just look at the Sustainable Development Goals. There's food, there's health, there's information, there's financial, transportation, on and on and on down the list. Every single aspect by 2030, they've told us when their end goal is 2030, they want to have total control over every facet of your life.
Well, let me ask you this. Let's say someone's listening to this and they have a more sympathetic viewpoint of these individuals. They assume, hey, these people, they are titans of their respective industries. They've got billions of dollars, or they have, the equivalent amount of clout internationally, and they might no longer be interested in the monetary side. Maybe they are truly at that level, just turning around and saying, hey, these are the world's problems. Let's help to fix these problems, like, for instance, overpopulation, the greenhouse gas emissions, things like that. What would you tell someone who has a more sympathetic view of these individuals?
Well, I mean, you mentioned overpopulation. A lot of these guys have more kids. George Soros, for example, he's got 5 children. Ted Turner, he's a guy who talks very in very bizarre and kind of alarming terms about overpopulation. Like Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, says that
first of all, you've got to stabilize the population and hopefully reduce the population by having a voluntary one-child family for 100 years, get the population back down to where Paul Ehrlich said it should be. It was about 2.5 billion people.
The ideal global population is somewhere between 250 million and 1 billion, maybe 2 billion people at the most. And he's called for a one-child policy worldwide. He's got more than 5 kids. And then, of course, you hear about the private jets. They fly around the world lecturing everybody else about climate change. Why can't they have their World Economic Forum meetings over Zoom? They locked down all of our countries. They made us go and socialize and view, family events via Zoom during the pandemic. Why can't they have their meetings via Zoom? And so regarding the charity aspect of it, I mean, is it charity if every dollar you give away comes back in the form of $2 more of profit? I mean, let's use Bill Gates, for example. Bill Gates, he was never charitable. I mean, I read all of the biographies, all of the memoirs, his father's memoir, a lot of the people who worked for Microsoft's memoir. Bill Gates was never charitable all through the founding of Microsoft, and he became the world's richest man. He had billions and billions of dollars. His mother actually pleaded with him. This is in his father's memoir. His mother would plead with him, please be more charitable, give your money away. Bill Gates wouldn't do it. He was known as this sort of cutthroat monopolist. Well, only after the Justice Department started investigating Microsoft for its antitrust, anti-competitive, monopolistic practices, that's when he sets up the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he sort of rebrands himself as a philanthropist. But his whole life, he was never known as that.
Interesting. Can you give the viewers an understanding of this meeting that took place at Rockefeller University in May of 2009?
Certainly. So if people remember back in 2009, climate change was never really this big, scary thing that it is today. I mean, I think Vice President Kamala Harris just the other day called it an existential crisis. And you hear that all the time. It's an existential crisis. What that means is they're saying that everybody's going to die if we don't turn over, our energy industry and our food industry to these supranational organizations. So in 2009, it was not that way. I mean, there was some talk of, global warming and maybe the ozone layer might be depleting. So in 2009, the kind of context of this is Barack Obama has just been elected, and his biggest benefactors, people like George Soros, Ted Turner is there, Oprah Winfrey is there. They all get together at Rockefeller University and talk about how to use this opportunity of Barack Obama's election, as well as it's right, in the throes of the financial crisis. And so there's, these billionaires who want to use their money at this time. Like, how do we pool our resources for something? What do we all care about? And they come away from this meeting. They call themselves the Good Club. They coined that term for themselves as, we're here to do good. And they come away from this meeting saying overpopulation is the #1 issue facing mankind. So why don't we all put our money together and help solve overpopulation? Now, there's no follow-up meeting that, that nobody's ever talked about the Good Club ever since. But from that meeting, this huge climate change narrative has really exploded. And so they view, seizing control over the energy sector, over the health sector, over the financial sector as a way to solve climate change. Now, the pandemic came along and it turned out to be an even better opportunity for their missions. But that's the Good Club meeting. And it really kicks off the kind of this crisis after crisis we see now.
One thing it would be interesting to for you to explicate on a bit further is the Rockefeller Foundation's role in all this, because I know in sort of the zeitgeist right now in America, a lot more people know about Bill Gates and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and all their and how they have all their hands in all these different industries. That people understand more about George Soros's and the World Economic Forum's roles in some of these things. But the Rockefeller Institute is this sort of very, it's out in the open. It's not very hidden, but a lot of people don't know what they're really up to. Like, for instance, back in in the 40s and 50s, they funded a lot of research for agriculture, and they helped to develop seeds that were more resistant to pests and drought conditions. And so from one perspective, they actually helped to have more population on the earth. Some estimates say that their work directly resulted in several more billion people on the planet. So can you sort of give us an outline of how does the Rockefeller Foundation fit into all this?
Yeah, that's a great point. And just on that point you make about how their work saving lives created a problem they're now trying to solve. They also made the chemicals and the fertilizers that they now want to ban part of Standard Oil. So it's sort of convenient how they can, in a way, create crises that they later help solve. But the Rockefellers are really the control oligarch prototype. They are the main characters in Chapter 1. They're really who Bill Gates has modeled his philanthropic empire after. And so there's some kind of crazy coincidences between the Rockefellers and Bill Gates. So it goes all the way back to the very early 1900s. Standard Oil was a trust. It was a monopoly. It was using cutthroat tactics, spying on competitors, stealing competitors' business, using lawfare, 130 years ago to put competitors out of business. And so the Department of Justice in the very early 1900s starts looking into Standard Oil. The Rockefellers didn't have really much philanthropy at that time, like any. And so, they would tithe. He was a Baptist, but John D. Rockefeller hires this guy, Frederick Gates, no relation to Bill, to help him set up a philanthropic empire. And so they rebranded and they went from being these cutthroat monopolists, oil barons, to saving lives. And part of that was setting up the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which is now Rockefeller University. And they really started studying diseases. And they found that internationally, if you can go into a country, a third world country especially, and you can convince that government that you've got cures for these diseases, the government, you basically run a portion of that government, their public health division. So this was figured out over 100 years ago. Now, Bill Gates has really taken the torch in a lot of ways to become the author of global health policy. But the Rockefellers, you mentioned in the 40s and the 50s with the Green Revolution, they developed these seeds. They were sort of tinkering with genetics before they even got into crops and seeds. Now, the Green Revolution rounded up all the heirloom seeds and they took them to labs and they kind of figured out how to breed different plants to be resistant to things like DDT and other herbicides and insecticides, and also flourish with certain types of fertilizers. And so that really helped them take over another portion of the third world, mostly's government is the agricultural department. So both the health and the agriculture, if you can control the health and the agriculture or claim to be saving people, which and they do deserve credit. They did save a lot of lives. Poverty and starvation is a big crisis, and famine and drought. So they do deserve credit in that regard. But it led to a system now with both in the food industry and the health industry that is tightly controlled by powerful interests who don't necessarily have your best interests in mind.
Let me ask you about the overpopulation aspect of it, because I imagine that, okay, so I can imagine that you want to fix starvation, and so you create these resilient crops, so people in third world countries can grow these crops. They're resistant to drought, pests, etc. More food equals more people, more flourishing. So that's how you solve, let's say, that problem. When the problem is overpopulation, what does the solution look like? I mean, you mentioned the one-child policy, but I mean, I've read multiple books about how that played out in China in like a concrete way. And it doesn't play out like, oh yeah, everyone is just like, yeah, I'm on board with the system and the government. It's like, no, you have government goons chasing women down in rural areas to give them forced abortions. I mean, that's how that actually plays out in practice. So like, is that what they're suggesting? Like how do you fix overpopulation?
Well, it's a number of ways, and it's a great question, Roman, and that's another question I sought to answer, because you see Bill Gates give these TED Talks, and he talks about how the global population is exploding and we're headed for 9 billion people, and we really need to bring that number down 10 to 15%. And so they are very concerned to this day about overpopulation. And just a point on overpopulation, there's no evidence that the Earth is going to run out of resources. There's many scientists who think that we could double our current population and still be fine. And studies have been done that show that if everybody lived as densely as people in Manhattan live, we could fit the entire 8 billion global population on the island of New Zealand, or certainly Australia. Nobody would want to live so densely populated like that. But nonetheless, that would leave the entire planet empty. So this overpopulation thing, it's a myth. It persists. And that's the question I sort of wanted to answer is, A, is there some sort of crazy conspiracy? I mean, there's a lot of theories out there. What are the facts? And so Bill Gates says, because it's counterintuitive, right? How do you bring down overpopulation by saving lives, by curing starvation and curing diseases and curing malaria? It doesn't seem to make any sense. The one element to it that does make sense is, yes, the birth control, family planning is a term the Rockefellers hired public relations experts to develop. Maternal health is another euphemism they use. But really what it is mass abortion, mass birth control, sterilization in the form of, let's say, a transgender youth. This may sound like conspiracy, but there's a report funded by Planned Parenthood and the Rockefeller Foundation going back in the 1960s, where encourage increased homosexuality, end quote, is one of the items on the list for how to bring down the birth rate. And so you actually look at the birth rates, especially in Western countries, they have been brought down. I mean, we are at historic lows in the United States. People used to have more kids. A quote propaganda campaign is in the Kissinger report, who Henry Kissinger made population control a part of U.S. policy. He was a very powerful diplomat and official in multiple presidential administrations. He had a memo that he was a believer in this overpopulation problem, and propaganda campaigns convincing people that it's not good for the planet to have children. And China's one-child policy, by the way, was really, it's not in the best interest of a country, as many countries are learning today. It's not in the best interest of the country to limit population growth. Population growth equals more growth overall in the GDP, in the workforce. It is good for a country to have a growing population. We're going to find out pretty quick when none of us our age have Social Security when we try to retire. There's not going to be enough people to pay into the Social Security. So you're paying Social Security now out of your paycheck, but you're never going to get that back because of the population, plummeting. It's plummeting. It's really not a good situation.
Mm. Last question I have is how like truly far out are these individuals thinking? Because let me give you the example of the Netherlands, for instance. In the Netherlands, we discovered that the UN agenda manifests in the form, like it manifests differently in different countries. In the UN, in the Netherlands, the environmentalists hooked onto this agreement that the Dutch government had with the EU like 30 years ago. It was called the Natura 2000 agreement. It was like, okay, we need to protect this type of flora in the countryside. Like, basically nitrogen levels need to be kept at a certain level in order for this flora to thrive. And so instead of like renegotiating that deal 30 years later, they said, hey, we actually need to kick off all these farmers because the nitrogen levels have gotten too high for this 30-year-old agreement. That then forces the farmers off their land. But the farmers are saying, hey, these government officials are out here and they're planning to take our land and convert it into housing because there's a housing crisis in the Netherlands, but not because the local population is having a lot of kids, but because there's migrants flooding into the country, right? And so, and there's this plan to make Holland, the entire country, essentially like the New York of Europe, to essentially make it, like you described, like a very densely populated Manhattan type zone, but in a large area like you mentioned Australia, but in this case it would be the Netherlands. So it seems like it's a very interconnected plot. And along with that, of course, is the fact that if you remove these farmers with their beef cattle, you need to replace the protein source, and you have the rise of like synthetic meat and insect production. So you kind of look at it and it's like, wow, it's like a very holistic plan that looks like every little piece fits in perfectly together. Is that just like in hindsight, through a 2020 lens, you can kind of look at it and say, wow, it fits all together? And is it basically, my question is it just organically kind of synthesizing this way because everyone is ideologically aligned and they're moving in a certain direction? Or are they actually pre-planning these sort of things and then enacting it? Like which one of those two?
It is completely pre-planned. I mean, that may sound crazy, but I have read through all of the reports from organizations like the Club of Rome, the World Economic Forum, going back to the 70s. Now, really, in Henry Kissinger is a great person to look into. He's now passed away, but he was an agent of the Rockefellers, and this is around the time of their Green Revolution. In the mid 1950s, they hired him to run this special studies division of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is one of their various philanthropies. So the Rockefeller Brothers Fund hired Henry Kissinger and a ton of other thought leaders and experts and titans of industry. It had this large panel, and the result of their studies was this book called Prospect for America. Now, it's really a globalist book and a prospect for the world, but this became the policy guide for presidents like JFK and Richard Nixon, and moving forward. Now they put out new reports through the various organizations that they fund, like the World Economic Forum, like the Club of Rome, which really guides, these think tanks, these global control oligarch think tanks, that becomes policy via the UN. So they are where the ideas come from before the United Nations, and then the United Nations makes these compacts and agreements that get passed to the EU or the United States, and various countries eventually sign on, and eventually it trickles down to your local politician level. But this Prospect for America book that came out, it was 600 pages. It's huge. It talks about opening up of borders, and this is one of the things that George Soros is very heavily invested in, is removing of borders. Why? Because countries, individual countries and nations with a strong ethnic identity, they don't want to be controlled. They like freedom. They like their identity. And so when you, flood various countries, that effectively removes power from the countries and more towards international institutions controlled by them.
Wow. Well, Seamus, thank you so much. If anyone's interested in the book, we'll throw a link to it down in the description box below. Thank you so much for the elucidating talk.
Thanks, Roman.